Hello, everyone. Welcome to Sleep Space. Tonight we will talk about something mysterious, something that touches on both science and philosophy, and perhaps even the deepest questions you've ever quietly wondered about while lying awake. The question is, what was your consciousness before you were born? What were you, if anything, before you opened your eyes for the very first time? When we talk about sleep, we often wonder about where our awareness goes when we drift into dreams. But tonight, we are going even further back, beyond memory, beyond birth, into a realm that no one alive can actually recall. And yet, it's a question that has captivated human thought for centuries. To begin, we have to first unravel what we even mean by consciousness. The word itself feels familiar but slippery, like trying to hold water in your hands. Consciousness is the ability to experience, to have a sense of I am. It's not just your memories or your thoughts or the way you feel happiness or sadness. It's the underlying awareness that there is something it feels like to be you. You wake up in the morning and without needing to think about it, there is an inner presence that looks out from your eyes and experiences the world. Neuroscientists debate exactly how this arises. Philosophers argue about whether it can ever be explained, and spiritual traditions often treat it as fundamental, something that cannot be reduced to biology alone. But regardless of which angle you take, the central puzzle remains. If you are conscious now, where was that consciousness before the day you were born? Some would say the answer is simple: nowhere. According to many scientists and materialists, consciousness is a product of the brain. Your brain, they argue, is like a highly advanced computer made of neurons and chemistry. Before your brain developed inside your mother's womb, there was no you in the sense of self-awareness. Just as a light bulb remains dark until electricity flows through it, so too your awareness only switched on once your brain had developed enough to support it. By this view, asking where you were before birth is like asking where the flame of a candle was before it was lit. It simply wasn't. But that explanation, while straightforward, leaves many people unsatisfied. For one thing, the idea of absolute nothingness is hard to wrap our minds around. Can you actually imagine not existing? The moment you try, your consciousness is still there, imagining what it would be like not to be conscious. The concept seems to dissolve the second we try to hold it. This is why some philosophers and spiritual thinkers argue that consciousness may not just be a byproduct of biology, it might be more fundamental, something that exists in some form regardless of whether or not a body is present to host it. To explore this, let's go back to the womb. Science can tell us about the gradual development of awareness before birth. In the earliest stages, when the embryo is just a cluster of cells, there is no nervous system, no brain, no awareness. But as the weeks pass, the neural tube forms, neurons begin to connect, and eventually, by around the third trimester, brain waves resembling those of a newborn begin to appear. Some researchers believe this may mark the beginning of rudimentary consciousness, a faint glow of awareness emerging from the silence. Yet even if this is true, it doesn't tell us what came before. It only tells us when measurable activity began. This is where ancient traditions step in with their own answers. In Hindu philosophy, for example, consciousness is not created by the brain at all. Instead, the brain is seen as more like a receiver, a tool that allows a much greater, universal consciousness to filter into an individual form. According to this view, before you were born, your consciousness was part of a vast, infinite ocean of awareness, waiting to take shape in a human body. Buddhism offers similar teachings with its ideas of rebirth, suggesting that what you call you is a continuation of patterns from before, flowing into a new body, not as a fixed soul, but as a stream of energy and consciousness. The Greeks wondered about this too. Plato believed that the soul existed before birth, dwelling in a realm of perfect forms and knowledge, and that being born into a body was like forgetting what you once knew. According to him, learning during life was not so much about gaining new information, but rather remembering truths your soul already encountered before entering the world. Contrast that with modern neuroscience again, and you see the gap between worldviews. Neuroscientists might say your sense of self is tied entirely to your brain activity, that before your neurons fired, there was no you, and after death, when the neurons go quiet, you will be no more. Yet spiritual traditions claim you are not the neurons themselves, but something that can exist beyond them. And here's the interesting twist. Some modern theories in physics give a strange kind of opening for these older ideas. In quantum mechanics, reality itself is not as solid and fixed as it appears. At the smallest scales, particles exist in states of probability until observed, and some scientists and philosophers have speculated that consciousness plays a role in collapsing those probabilities into actual events. While this is debated and far from settled science, it raises a provocative question. If consciousness is somehow woven into the fabric of reality, then perhaps it does not begin or end with the body. Perhaps the body is simply one place where consciousness manifests. But let's pause here and ask something personal. What does your intuition tell you? When you think back before your earliest memory, before your birth, do you imagine nothingness? Or do you imagine something else? Maybe a kind of dreamlike state, or a sense of floating presence. Some people report strange feelings when they think deeply about this, almost as if they brush against something they cannot fully articulate. We can also look at children for clues. Throughout history, there have been reports of very young children speaking about experiences or memories that do not belong to their current life, descriptions of places they've never been, or details they should not know. These cases are rare and controversial, but they have fueled research into reincarnation. Scientists such as Dr. Ian Stevenson at the University of Virginia spent decades documenting such accounts, interviewing families, and checking details. While many remain skeptical, the consistency of some of these reports suggests that the mystery of consciousness before birth might be deeper than we assume. Another way to approach this is through the lens of biology. Every human being carries genetic material passed down through countless generations. Before you were born, parts of you quite literally existed in the form of DNA, a molecular script billions of years old. Your eyes, your hair, your physical features, all of these were written long before you ever opened your eyes. But DNA doesn't just carry physical traits. Some researchers believe it might also encode predispositions, instincts, or even subtle influences on how consciousness takes shape. Could it be that your awareness before birth was somehow tied to this deep biological inheritance, waiting for the right moment to awaken? Still, biology only tells us part of the story. If you were only your DNA, you would be identical to every other human with similar genes. But you're not. You're uniquely you, with your own thoughts, your own experiences, your own flavor of being conscious. This is why the question of where you were before birth remains so powerful. It touches on something that science has not yet fully explained. Some thinkers go even further, suggesting that time itself is not linear in the way we experience it. In physics, the past, present, and future might all exist at once, like pages in a book. If that's true, then your consciousness might not simply start at birth and end at death. Instead, it could be one thread of awareness moving through a much larger tapestry of existence, always there, just shifting forms. By this view, before you were born, you already existed in some sense, but outside the perspective of linear time. Imagine this: you're a wave in the ocean. Before the wave rises, the water is already there. The wave is simply a shape the water takes for a while before sinking back into the sea. By that metaphor, your consciousness before birth could be like the water, formless, part of something vast, waiting for the moment to rise into the distinct shape of you. And when the wave falls again, it doesn't vanish. It returns to the ocean, ready to rise again in some new way. Of course, metaphors can only take us so far. The truth is, we may never fully know what our consciousness was before we are born, but the act of wondering, of asking, is itself deeply human. It reminds us that our existence is not something to take for granted. It urges us to see life as precious, mysterious, and maybe even miraculous. So tonight, as you think about this question, let your mind drift between science and spirituality, between logic and wonder. You don't need to choose one definitive answer. You can let the question itself become a kind of meditation, an open door to possibilities that stretch beyond the boundaries of what we normally imagine. When we look at the question of what you were before you were born, we often encounter two powerful forces of thought: the certainty of science and the openness of imagination. Science urges us to rely on observable data, measurable facts, and testable theories. Imagination, however, allows us to wander beyond the limits of proof into possibilities that science hasn't yet caught up to, or maybe never will. To truly explore this question, we need both. If we limit ourselves only to what can be measured, we risk flattening a deeply mysterious question into a neat but unsatisfying box. If we rely only on imagination, we risk floating so far from reality that we lose touch with reason. Somewhere between these two lies the richest ground for exploration. Let's begin by considering what modern neuroscience has to say. One of the leading ideas in the scientific study of consciousness is known as the Integrated Information Theory, or IEIT. According to this framework, consciousness arises wherever there's a system capable of integrating information in a certain complex way. Your brain, with its billions of neurons connected by trillions of synapses, is an extraordinarily integrated system, and thus it generates the rich experience of being you. But before your brain developed, before those connections formed in the womb, there was no such integration, and therefore no consciousness. By this explanation, you quite literally did not exist before your brain reached a certain threshold of complexity. That explanation makes logical sense, yet it doesn't fully address why consciousness feels so deeply real. It treats awareness like a property that emerges from complexity, but it doesn't explain the raw experience of it, the fact that there is something it feels like to be you. That mystery, often called the hard problem of consciousness, leaves the door open to alternative possibilities. Maybe consciousness doesn't emerge from the brain at all. Maybe it already exists and the brain is simply a filter or receiver. This view is sometimes called panpsychism, the idea that consciousness is a fundamental property of the universe, present in some form everywhere, even in the simplest particles. If panpsychism is true, then the question of what you were before you were born shifts dramatically. Instead of being nothing, you may have been something diffuse, part of a universal field of awareness, a spark waiting to coalesce into individuality. You may not have had memories or a personality, but you may have existed as awareness itself, not yet bound to a body. Think of a radio signal that's always present, filling the air, even before a radio is turned on to receive it. When your brain developed, it tuned into that frequency, giving rise to the sense of self you experience now. This idea might sound abstract, but consider this. In physics, fields are everywhere. The electromagnetic field, for example, permeates the entire universe, and every charged particle interacts with it. Could consciousness work in a similar way, as an ever-present field that every living brain taps into? Some scientists are beginning to wonder. Although it's far from proven, research in quantum biology hints at connections between quantum effects and consciousness. If these connections turn out to be real, it might mean that awareness is woven into the very fabric of reality, and you, before birth, were part of that unseen fabric. But let's shift from science to a more human perspective. If you try to recall your earliest memory, how far back can you go? For most people, memories begin somewhere between the ages of 3 and 5. Psychologists call this childhood amnesia. Before that, we have no conscious recall, even though we were alive, perceiving the world and learning. In fact, research shows that infants are deeply aware in ways we don't often realize. They recognize voices, respond to emotional tones, and even show preferences for certain kinds of music. If we can't remember our first years, even though we were conscious, it raises a haunting question. Is it possible that we also can't remember what came before birth? Not because it didn't exist, but because memory itself had not yet taken shape. This leads us to stories of prenatal experiences. Some people claim to have memories of being in the womb, descriptions of warmth, muffled sounds, floating sensations. While many psychologists argue that these are constructed memories formed later from imagination or suggestion, others consider the possibility that fragments of awareness may actually persist from that time. If that's true, then perhaps your consciousness was already stirring before birth in ways you cannot now recall. Religious traditions offer their own perspectives. In Christianity, for example, some interpretations suggest that the soul is created at the moment of conception, unique and new. Others argue that the soul pre-exists, known by God before it is placed in a body. In Islam, there is the belief that the soul enters the fetus at a certain stage of development, breathed in by divine will. In Judaism, some mystical teachings, especially in the Kabbalah, hint that the soul has journeys before entering a body. These teachings may differ in details, but they share a common intuition, that the self, the spark of awareness, is more than just neurons firing. It is something deeper, something that may have a story even before birth. If you pause for a moment and try to imagine yourself before birth, what comes to mind? Some people describe it as darkness, but not emptiness, more like a waiting place, quiet and timeless. Others imagine being part of a great light, or a vast presence. These descriptions may not be literal truths, but they reveal something important. The human mind resists the idea of absolute nothingness. We instinctively reach for metaphors of continuation, connection, or potential. Philosophers like Arthur Schopenhauer even argued that our very resistance to imagining nothingness is evidence that consciousness might be timeless. He believed that our awareness is not something that begins and ends, but something that flows through different forms. He once compared life to a dream. Before you awaken in this body, you might have been dreaming another dream, and after this life, another dream will follow. To put it another way, the story of your consciousness might not be a straight line with a beginning and an end, but a cycle, a rhythm, like inhaling and exhaling. Before you were born, you were in the inhale, unseen but full of potential. Birth was the exhale, the emergence into the visible world. Death one day may be another inhale, drawing you back into mystery. Even if you prefer a strictly scientific explanation, there is still beauty in thinking about the improbable chain of events that led to your existence. Before you were born, you were the possibility of life carried in the DNA of your parents, and before them, your grandparents, stretching back through countless generations. You were potential encoded in the universe itself. At some point, a nearly infinite sequence of coincidences converged to bring about your particular consciousness, here and now. In that sense, before you were born, you were already present, written into the story of existence, waiting for your cue to appear. Let's step back and consider a thought experiment. Imagine a vast library filled with every possible book that could ever be written. Somewhere in that library is the story of you, every detail of your life, every thought you will ever have, every choice you will ever make. Before you were born, that book was already there, even if it hadn't been opened yet. You were, in some sense, the potential of that story, waiting for the first page to be read. Existence, then, may not be about creating something from nothing, but about bringing what was always possible into the realm of the actual. This perspective aligns with certain interpretations of time in physics. The block universe theory suggests that past, present, and future all coexist in a four-dimensional structure, like a loaf of bread with each slice representing a moment in time. From within the slice, you perceive a flow of time, but the entire loaf exists at once. If that's true, then your life, your birth, your existence, your future, already exists as part of this block. Before you were born, you were not absent. You were simply in a part of the block that you had not yet reached from your own perspective. These ideas might feel overwhelming, but they all circle back to the same mystery. The fact that you are here, now, experiencing awareness. That is something extraordinary. In a universe of countless stars, galaxies, and inanimate matter, a portion of reality has become conscious of itself through you. Whether your consciousness came into existence at birth, or whether it existed before in some timeless way, the fact remains, it is here now, alive and present, and that in itself is a profound mystery worth savouring. If you stop to reflect on the mystery of consciousness before birth, another angle opens up: memory. Memory shapes how we experience existence. It gives us continuity, a sense that the you of yesterday is the same as the you of today. Without memory, identity itself starts to dissolve. So when we ask what you were before you were born, part of the difficulty lies in the fact that there are no memories to anchor the question. The slate seems blank, which makes the imagination rush to fill it with theories, metaphors, or beliefs. But perhaps memory itself hides deeper truths. Some psychologists believe that memory is not just a personal archive, but something woven into our biology. Even if you can't recall your earliest experiences, your body remembers. Infants, for example, are born with reflexes, instinctive movements and reactions that seem to carry knowledge of survival without needing to be taught. A baby turns its head toward the breast for feeding, grips with surprising strength, and startles at loud sounds. These aren't learned behaviors, but inherited patterns, encoded in the nervous system. Could it be that before birth, your consciousness was not empty, but operating in this instinctive way, aware, but not in a way that could be recalled as memory? This brings us to the concept of implicit memory, which begins forming even in the womb. Studies show that fetuses can recognize their mother's voice, and some even respond to music played repeatedly during pregnancy. That means experiences before birth can leave an imprint, even if they are not remembered in the traditional sense. In other words, a part of you might already have been aware, feeling and responding to the world long before your first cry. But the lack of explicit memory makes it feel as though you did not exist at all. Philosophically, this points to something profound. Perhaps consciousness is not tied to memory at all. You are not your memories. You are the awareness that experiences them. This distinction is subtle but critical. If you lose all memory, as happens in certain forms of amnesia, you still remain conscious, still experiencing, still you in some essential sense. That suggests that even if you had no memories before birth, consciousness itself could still have been there, present in some form, but simply not recording. This is where we encounter another fascinating idea, the notion of the collective unconscious, introduced by Carl Jung. Jung proposed that beneath our personal unconscious, the layer of forgotten memories, dreams, and desires unique to us, there lies a deeper layer shared by all humans. This collective unconscious contains archetypes, universal symbols, and patterns of thought that appear across cultures and history. Myths of the hero's journey, images of the mother, the trickster, the shadow. These emerge everywhere, as if humanity shares a psychic blueprint. If Jung was right, then before you were born, your consciousness may not have been a blank void at all. Instead, it may have been plugged into this collective reservoir of images, instincts, and symbolic truths. Consider how dreams often draw from these archetypes. Even if you've never read ancient myths, you might dream of battles, journeys, mysterious guides, or otherworldly landscapes that echo them. Jung believed this was evidence of the collective unconscious at work, feeding individual awareness with imagery older than any single life. If so, then your consciousness before birth may have been part of this timeless flow, swimming in the deeper currents of human psyche, waiting to take form as you. The theme of shared consciousness appears in other traditions too. Many indigenous cultures teach that before birth, the spirit dwells in another realm, often described as the spirit world, where it is connected to ancestors and nature. In these teachings, birth is not the beginning of existence, but a transition from one state of being to another. The child is believed to bring with them not only life, but also wisdom and connection from this prior realm. This perspective suggests that your consciousness before birth was not isolated but intertwined with the living web of those who came before you. Now let's consider biology again, because biology can add depth to this idea of inheritance. Your DNA doesn't just carry physical traits, it also carries epigenetic markers, chemical instructions that switch genes on and off depending on the experiences of your ancestors. For example, trauma experienced by one generation can leave marks on their DNA that affect the health and stress responses of future generations. That means, in a very real biological sense, part of your consciousness may have been shaped before you were born by the lives of those who came before you. You were not starting from zero. You were carrying echoes, biological memories of generations past. This is strikingly similar to the concept of ancestral memory, which appears in myth and folklore across the world. Many cultures teach that we inherit not only physical traits, but also spiritual or emotional legacies. Whether viewed through the lens of epigenetics or mythology, the message is similar. Before you were born, part of you was already carrying the weight and wisdom of lives that preceded yours. But what about the possibility that your consciousness was not just influenced by ancestors, but was, in fact, already present in some timeless way? Some philosophies suggest that birth is not the start, but the narrowing of consciousness. Imagine an infinite field of awareness, boundless and formless. To be born is to focus that awareness into a single point, a lens. Before birth, you may have been the field, expansive and undefined. With birth, you became the lens, narrowing down into individuality. Death, then, may simply be the release of that focus, returning to the field once more. This idea resonates with the concept of Indra's net from ancient Buddhist philosophy. Indra's net is an infinite web, with a jewel at each intersection. Each jewel reflects every other jewel, creating a universe where everything is interconnected and each part contains the whole. Before you were born, you may have been one jewel among countless others, reflecting and being reflected, inseparable from the whole. Birth did not create you from nothing. It merely illuminated one jewel, drawing attention to it for a time. Science, too, offers metaphors that echo this. In physics, energy cannot be created or destroyed. It can only change form. Consciousness, if it is a form of energy, might follow the same principle. Before you were born, your consciousness may have existed in another form, perhaps scattered, diffuse, unrecognizable, as the you know now, but real nonetheless. Birth could then be seen as a transformation, a reconfiguration of energy into the pattern that became your awareness. Another perspective worth considering is the idea of probability. Before you were born, the odds of your existence were astronomically small. Every detail, from your parents' meeting to the precise moment of conception, had to align for you to appear. Mathematicians have calculated that the probability of any one person existing is so staggeringly unlikely that it borders on impossible. And yet, here you are. Some philosophers argue that this improbability suggests existence itself might not be random. Perhaps before you were born, you were possibility, pure potential waiting to collapse into reality. Just as particles in quantum mechanics exist in states of probability until observed, maybe you existed as potential until the moment life began. This brings us to a fascinating intersection of science and mysticism, the idea that consciousness itself may be what collapses potential into reality. Some interpretations of quantum theory propose that the act of observation is what brings possibilities into actuality. If that's true, then perhaps before you were born, you were both potential and observer, waiting for the moment when the two would meet. When your life began, possibility became actuality, and you became aware of yourself. At this point, we can step back and notice how every perspective, scientific, spiritual, philosophical, seems to circle around the same mystery from different angles. Some say you were nothing before birth. Others say you were potential, or memory, or ancestral energy, or a piece of universal consciousness. What unites them is the recognition that existence itself is remarkable. The sheer fact that you are here, experiencing awareness, is not something to take for granted. When we contemplate what our consciousness might have been before birth, we inevitably bump up against the question of time. time feels like a line. First the past, then the present, then the future. Birth seems like a beginning, death an ending. But what if time itself is not what it seems? What if the very structure we use to frame before and after is more fluid, more mysterious than we imagine? If time is not linear, then the question of where you were before you were born becomes far stranger, and perhaps more profound. Einstein's theory of relativity shook our understanding of time by showing that it is not fixed. Time can stretch or compress depending on speed and gravity. Astronauts in orbit, moving at incredible speeds and experiencing weaker gravity than on Earth, actually age slightly more slowly than those of us on the ground. The flow of time, something we take for granted as universal, is relative to perspective. This raises a staggering thought. If time itself is flexible, could our sense of before and after be an illusion? If so, then your consciousness before birth might not be before at all. It could exist in a different slice of time, always present, just outside the perspective of your current awareness. Some physicists go further, suggesting that the universe is best understood as a four-dimensional block, where past, present, and future all exist simultaneously. In this view, birth is not the beginning of consciousness. It is simply the point where your perspective enters the block. Imagine a movie reel. The entire film exists at once, every frame from beginning to end. You, the viewer, experience the story frame by frame, creating the illusion of flow. Similarly, your life might be one sequence within the block universe, already complete, already existing. Before birth, you were not absent, you were simply in frames not yet reached by your conscious viewpoint. This might sound abstract, but consider déjà vu. That eerie sensation of having already lived a moment suggests that consciousness sometimes slips outside its usual sense of time. While many scientists explain déjà vu as a glitch in memory processing, others consider whether it reveals something deeper, that consciousness may not be fully bound by linear time. If true, then before birth, your consciousness could have existed in some timeless form, not as a memory, but as presence. We can also look to mystical traditions, many of which have long taught that time is not linear. In Hindu cosmology, time is cyclical, moving through vast ages called yugas, endlessly repeating. In Buddhism, the cycle of samsara portrays life as birth, death, and rebirth, with consciousness flowing from one life to the next. For these traditions, asking what you were before birth is not a puzzle. It is part of a cycle without beginning or end. You have always existed in one form or another, carried by the rhythm of time itself. There's a fascinating parallel in modern cosmology. Some scientists now suggest that the universe itself may not have a single beginning. Instead of one big bang, there may be cycles of expansion and contraction, with universes blooming and collapsing like cosmic seasons. If reality itself is cyclical, why wouldn't consciousness follow the same pattern? Just as energy transforms but never disappears, perhaps awareness too cycles through forms, endlessly renewed. Let's step into another possibility, that consciousness is not located within time at all, but that time itself is something consciousness generates. Think about dreams. When you dream, your brain creates a sense of time passing. A dream that lasts only minutes in real life can feel like hours, even days. Consciousness can generate time internally as part of the experience. Could our waking reality be similar? If so, then before birth, your consciousness might not have been located in time as we know it. It could have existed in a state beyond time, only entering into the clockwork rhythm of minutes and hours when tied to a body. Philosophers have wrestled with this question for centuries. Immanuel Kant argued that time is not something out there in the universe, but a structure of the mind, a way we organize experience. By that logic, before birth, without a mind to perceive, time as you know it did not exist. Consciousness may have been in a state beyond time, where before and after lose meaning. This is difficult to grasp because our entire sense of self is bound up with time. You are the sum of your past, living in the present, anticipating the future. To imagine your consciousness beyond time is to imagine an identity not built on sequence, not anchored in memory, not moving from one moment to the next. But perhaps that's closer to the truth. Maybe before birth, your consciousness was not limited by the ticking of clocks. Maybe it existed in a kind of eternal now. Mystics often describe experiences of timelessness during deep meditation or altered states of consciousness. They report a sense of being outside of time, where past and future dissolve and only pure awareness remains. If such states are possible while alive, perhaps they hint at what consciousness might be like before birth: formless, timeless, infinite. There is also a fascinating connection between time and identity. Think about how your sense of self has changed over your life. The child you once were is not the same as the adult you are now. Your thoughts, your feelings, your body, everything has changed. And yet, there is a continuous thread of awareness that feels like you. This suggests that identity may not be about the details of experience, but about the continuity of consciousness itself. If that's true, then before birth, you may have been that same continuity, existing without identity, waiting to take on form. Consider also the strange way in which time shapes potential. Before you were born, you existed in the form of possibility. Every potential version of you, the choices you would make, the person you would become, already existed in some sense, waiting for the flow of time to actualize them. This mirrors the concept of the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, where every possible outcome exists in parallel universes. If that interpretation is correct, then before birth, your consciousness may have existed as pure possibility, spread across countless potential versions, waiting for one timeline to be chosen. But here's where the question deepens even further. If consciousness is not confined by time, could it be that you existed not just before birth, but always? Maybe the awareness looking through your eyes right now is the same awareness that has looked through countless lives, countless forms. What changes are the shapes, the stories, the identities, but not the awareness itself. This echoes the teaching from certain non-dual philosophies that there is only one consciousness appearing as many, wearing masks of individuality. Before you were born, you were still that one consciousness, waiting for the next mask to be placed. To bring this closer to daily experience, think about moments when you lose your sense of self, when you're so absorbed in music, art, or nature that the boundaries of I seem to fade. In those moments, you feel connected to something larger, something beyond time and identity. Perhaps this is a glimpse of what consciousness was before birth, unbounded, not yet narrowed into the story of you. As we continue to explore the question of what your consciousness was before you were born, it's worth pausing to notice how this mystery stirs both awe and unease. On one hand, the idea that you may have come from nothingness is unsettling, an absolute void, a blank absence of being. On the other hand, the thought that you may have existed before birth, in some form beyond comprehension, can be equally unsettling, because it challenges the sense that your life is singular and unique. Either way, the question forces you to face the boundaries of what you know, and perhaps even the boundaries of what can be known. But within those boundaries lies a space rich with ideas, connections, and possibilities. One approach that deepens the conversation is to think about the relationship between consciousness and matter. Science tells us that your body is made of atoms, the same atoms that have existed since the dawn of the universe. The carbon in your cells, the calcium in your bones, the iron in your blood. All of it was forged in stars billions of years ago. Before you were born, the physical building blocks of your body already existed, scattered across the cosmos. If that's true for your body, could something similar be true for your consciousness? Perhaps consciousness, like matter, is not created anew for each life, but is instead rearranged, recombined, re-expressed. This brings us to the idea of emergent properties. In science, an emergent property is something that arises from the interaction of simpler parts, but cannot be predicted from those parts alone. Wetness is an emergent property of water molecules. No single molecule is wet, but when they combine, wetness appears. Consciousness, many argue, is an emergent property of the brain. Before your neurons assembled, there was no consciousness. But when enough of them connected in the right way, the emergent property of awareness appeared. From this view, before you were born, you were not conscious, but the ingredients for your consciousness were already gathering, waiting to combine into something greater. But here is where the mystery deepens. If consciousness is emergent, does that mean it vanishes completely when the parts are dismantled? Or does it leave a trace, the way a melody lingers in memory even after the notes have stopped? Some philosophers argue that once an emergent property appears, it cannot be entirely undone. The pattern of consciousness, once formed, may exist in ways we do not yet understand. If that's true, then perhaps your awareness before birth was not absent but latent, encoded in the patterns of matter and energy waiting for the right conditions to awaken. This line of thought resonates with ancient philosophies. The Upanishads, ancient Hindu texts, describe consciousness as like a spark hidden in wood. It is always there, but it needs the friction of life to ignite. Before birth, you were the unlit spark, present but not yet aflame. Birth struck the match, and awareness blazed into being. Yet even before that, the potential for fire was real. Another angle to consider is language. Language shapes consciousness in profound ways. Without words, our awareness is raw, immediate, less structured. Infants are conscious, but their world is not divided by categories or concepts. They live in a state of pure perception, flowing from one sensation to the next. Only later does language carve experience into shapes: tree, sky, me, you. So, what does this mean for consciousness before birth? It may have been consciousness without language, awareness without words, a state of being closer to sensation and presence than to thought. This idea echoes mystical reports of transcendent experiences, where words fail and silence becomes the only language. People who have undergone deep meditation or near-death experiences often describe a state of pure awareness beyond language, beyond self. They say it cannot be described, only felt. Perhaps your consciousness before birth was something like that, a state without words, without story, but deeply real nonetheless. We can also turn to the study of near-death experiences, NDEs. which offer intriguing parallels. People who have been clinically dead for moments and then revived often report sensations of leaving the body, encountering light, or experiencing unity with something larger. While science explains some of these phenomena as brain responses to trauma, the vividness and consistency of reports across cultures suggest that consciousness may persist outside of normal brain activity. If awareness can exist independent of the body at the end of life, could it not also exist before the body at the beginning? Connected to this is the idea of interlife experiences, claims by some individuals, especially children, of remembering a space between lives. These stories describe a realm of light, guidance, or planning, where the soul chooses its next life. While such accounts cannot be scientifically verified, they appear often enough in human history to suggest a pattern in how people intuitively imagine existence before birth. Even if symbolic, these stories express a deep belief that life is not a sudden appearance from nowhere, but part of a continuum. This continuum can also be seen through the lens of biology and evolution. Life did not begin with you. It did not begin with your parents. It stretches back through millions of years of evolution, each organism giving rise to the next. Before you were born, your consciousness may have been part of this grand chain, not as a fully formed self, but as the accumulated result of life striving, adapting, and learning. In this sense, your consciousness before birth was not nothing. It was life itself, an ancient inheritance refined over eons. Consider also the role of imagination in shaping this question. Imagination allows us to explore what cannot be proven. It gives us stories, symbols, metaphors to make sense of the unknown. Perhaps the real answer to what you were before birth cannot be expressed in rational terms at all. Perhaps it belongs to the realm of imagination, where truth is not about facts but about meaning. Myths of pre-existence, stories of souls, visions of cosmic fields. These may not be literal descriptions, but they are meaningful ways of grappling with the ineffable. Here's another fascinating perspective: information theory. In our digital age, we understand that information is fundamental. Data can be copied, transmitted, transformed, but it does not vanish. Some scientists now suggest that consciousness itself may be a form of information embedded in the universe. If that's true, then before you were born, your consciousness existed as information, waiting to be expressed in the physical form of your brain. Just as a song exists as sheet music before it is performed, your awareness may have existed as a pattern before it became experience. This leads to a haunting thought. Perhaps consciousness is not personal at all. Perhaps there is only one consciousness expressing itself through different forms, like one ocean forming many waves. Before you were born, you were still that ocean, not yet separated into the individual wave of you. Birth was the moment of differentiation, the point where the universal became particular. Death one day may be the return to the ocean. Some may find this idea comforting, others unsettling, but it resonates with reports from mystics and meditators who describe experiences of oneness, where the boundary between self and world dissolves. In those moments, they feel connected to everything, part of an indivisible whole. If that's what lies at the root of consciousness, then before birth, you were not nothing. You were everything. And yet science reminds us to stay humble. The brain is a remarkable organ, and much of what we call consciousness may indeed depend on its functioning. If so, then before birth, without a developed brain, you truly did not exist in any meaningful sense. But even here, there is wonder, for out of billions of possible combinations, your brain formed exactly as it did, giving rise to the unique awareness that is you. The improbability of your existence is astonishing. Even if you came from nothing, the fact that nothing gave rise to you is a miracle in itself. Let us begin with physics. One of the most intriguing theories in modern science is that of quantum mechanics, which tells us that the universe is not as solid and predictable as it seems. At the most fundamental level, particles exist in probabilities rather than certainties. They flicker between possibilities, collapsing into definite states only when observed. Some thinkers have suggested that consciousness itself may be tied to this strange behavior of the quantum world. If that is true, then before you were born, your consciousness may not have been nothing, but rather a probability, a potential state, waiting for the right moment to collapse into the particular form of you. This idea is sometimes referred to as quantum consciousness, though it remains speculative. Still, it invites us to imagine existence before birth as a kind of cloud of possibilities, like a fog where every path and potential self existed at once. When conception occurred, when the neurons began to form, when the brain developed, the fog collapsed into the specific person you now know as yourself. You are not nothing, you are possibility, waiting to become actuality. Now let's contrast this with philosophy. Philosophers have long wrestled with the idea of existence and non-existence. One of the oldest and most provocative statements comes from Parmenides, an ancient Greek philosopher who argued that what is, and what is not. To him, non-existence was not even possible. It could not be thought, spoken, or conceived. If that is true, then before you were born, you did not exist as a person, but you also were not nothing, because true nothingness cannot exist. Instead, you were part of what is, the eternal fabric of being itself. This philosophical stance finds echoes in Buddhist thought, which often describes existence as an ever-flowing stream. Individual lives are like eddies or ripples in the current, temporary forms that appear, shift, and dissolve. Before you were born, you were the stream itself, flowing endlessly, without the shape you now recognize as you. Birth carved out the temporary ripple of your life, but the current has always been flowing. But if this is true, then what does it mean for identity? If your consciousness existed as part of a universal stream before birth, does that mean your individuality is an illusion? Perhaps individuality is real but temporary, like a costume worn for a brief performance. Before birth, you were backstage, part of the larger ensemble, waiting for your role to begin. Biology offers yet another way to see this. Long before your consciousness emerged, you were encoded in genetic material. Half of your DNA came from your mother, half from your father, and each of them carried lineages stretching back through countless generations. You were not conscious yet, but you were written into the fabric of life, a story waiting to be told. Your eyes, your voice, even your inclinations, all were prepared in the script of DNA, passed along like a message through time. Before you were born, you were a story not yet read aloud. And yet biology alone cannot explain why that story feels alive from the inside. Why should matter arranged in a particular pattern suddenly become aware? This is known as the hard problem of consciousness, and it remains unsolved. If we cannot explain why we are conscious now, how can we ever hope to understand what we were before consciousness began? Still, the mystery itself has value, because it forces us to reflect on the fragile, improbable gift of awareness. Another perspective comes from the field of cosmology. The universe is around 13.8 billion years old. For nearly all of that time, you did not exist as a conscious being, and yet the universe unfolded in such a way that eventually stars formed, planets cooled, life arose, and consciousness appeared. In this vast timeline, your existence is a momentary flicker, but it is also the result of an unimaginably long chain of events. Before you were born, you were the universe becoming ready to know itself. As Carl Sagan once said, "We are a way for the cosmos to know itself." Your consciousness is not separate from the universe. It is the universe looking back at itself through your eyes. Think of it this way. Before you were born, you were starlight, dust, oceans, forests, ancestors. You were already here in countless forms, waiting to awaken as the person you now are. When you consider it like this, your consciousness did not appear suddenly out of nothing. It was always here in potential, in matter, in energy, in the unbroken flow of time. We can also approach this question from a psychological perspective. Carl Jung, the depth psychologist, proposed the concept of the collective unconscious, a layer of the mind shared by all humans, filled with archetypes and patterns inherited from our evolutionary past. According to Jung, this collective unconscious exists beyond the personal mind and influences our dreams, myths, and behaviors. From this perspective, before you were born, your consciousness may have already been connected to this vast reservoir of human experience. You were not yet an individual, but you were part of the shared psyche of humanity. This helps explain why certain symbols and stories repeat across cultures, why flood myths appear everywhere, why hero journeys are universal, why certain images strike us so deeply. Perhaps before you were born, you were already swimming in these archetypes, part of a timeless story that humanity has been telling since the beginning. But let's not ignore the simplest perspective of all, that before you were born, you were nothing, and your consciousness began with your brain. Many scientists take this view, and it has its own kind of beauty. Think of how astonishing it is that out of absolute absence, awareness bloomed. If nothing truly preceded your existence, then the fact that you now sit here, aware and reflecting on this question, is miraculous. The nothingness gave rise to everything you know. This view may not provide comfort, but it provides perspective. Life is fleeting, and awareness is rare, which makes it infinitely precious. The tension between these perspectives, scientific, philosophical, spiritual, reminds us that consciousness is not just a puzzle to solve, but a mirror reflecting our deepest values. Do we believe in continuity, in eternal existence, in soul and spirit? Do we believe in emergence, in chance, in the fragile beauty of temporary awareness? Or do we believe in something in between? A universe where both continuity and chance coexist in mysterious ways. Even if no final answer exists, the act of asking changes us. When you wonder about what you were before birth, you touch the vastness of existence itself. You recognize that your life is part of something greater, whether that something is the cosmos, the stream of life, or the flow of consciousness. This recognition can shift the way you live, making you more present, more grateful, more attuned to the mystery around you. And perhaps that is the real purpose of the question. Not to solve it, but to feel it. Not to close the mystery, but to open it wider. Before you were born, you may have been nothing. You may have been everything. You may have been potential, possibility, stream, story, archetype, or starlight. But now, you are here, aware, alive, asking, wondering. And that may be the greatest mystery of all. The human mind was designed to survive, to solve immediate problems of food, safety, and community, not to unravel cosmic mysteries. And yet here we are, compelled to ask what it means to have been nothing, or everything, before the spark of life began. Perhaps this is itself a clue. The fact that consciousness even has the ability to reflect upon its own origins suggests that it is not simply a biological accident, but part of something deeper, a thread in a larger tapestry. Let us first step into the ancient world, where cultures sought to explain pre-birth existence through myth and story. In ancient Greece, Plato described a realm of pure forms, where souls existed before entering bodies. For him, life was a forgetting, and learning was a kind of remembering, a recollection of truths the soul already knew before birth. The idea suggests that before you were born, your consciousness was not blank but wise, holding knowledge that has since been buried under the noise of the physical world. Contrast this with Buddhist thought, which emphasizes rebirth not as the transfer of a permanent soul, but as the continuation of causes and conditions. Imagine a candle lighting another candle. The flame passes on, but it is not the same flame, not the same material, only the continuation of energy. In this view, before you were born, you were not a static soul waiting in a queue, but rather the momentum of past causes, karmic winds pushing forward into new form. You were continuity without identity, existence without the same self you now recognize. Modern science, on the other hand, tends to reject the idea of continuity beyond genetic inheritance. From this perspective, before you were born, you were simply the absence of experience. Your neurons hadn't yet formed, so there was no consciousness. But this absence itself is puzzling, because it raises the question, how does the subjective I arise out of non-existence? How does a first moment of awareness happen? No matter how detailed our neuroscience becomes, the leap from matter to mind remains a profound gap. Some thinkers argue that this gap exists because we are asking the question from within the illusion of separateness. If consciousness is universal, as some traditions maintain, then there was never a before. You did not begin, you simply changed form. Just as a wave begins and ends but the ocean remains, your awareness may be a temporary crest of a much larger, eternal sea. Before you were born, you were the sea, still and vast, without the particular motion of the wave that is your current self. There is also a compelling perspective from indigenous traditions around the world. Many cultures view life as part of a cycle, where ancestors, land, spirit, and community form an unbroken circle. In some Native American teachings, the unborn are not separate from the living or the ancestors. They exist in the circle already, waiting for their turn to enter. Before you were born, you may have been present in this circle, connected to those who came before and those who will come after. This is not seen as speculative, but as reality woven into daily life, a reminder that existence is never linear, but cyclical. What if, instead of trying to pinpoint where you were before birth, we ask a slightly different question? What is the you that asks the question? When you look closely, you find that your sense of self is constantly shifting. You are not the same person you were as a child, nor even the same person you were yesterday. Your memories, thoughts, and emotions change from moment to moment. If the self is fluid, then perhaps the very idea of a fixed consciousness before birth is misleading. Maybe what existed before birth was not you, as you know yourself, but the raw possibility of awareness itself, which later became filtered through memory, body, and personality. This brings us back to the scientific puzzle of memory. Memory is often thought of as personal, but there are striking cases of children recalling experiences that seem to belong to lives they could not have lived. These cases, studied by researchers like Ian Stevenson, involve children describing details of previous lives that were later verified. While controversial, they hint at the possibility that memory, or at least fragments of it, can carry across lifetimes. If so, before you were born, your consciousness might have been holding echoes of other stories, waiting to take shape again in your current life. Another fascinating framework comes from the field of panpsychism, which suggests that consciousness is a fundamental property of the universe, present even at the level of particles. If every part of reality has some degree of awareness, then before you were born, your consciousness was diffused across the atoms and molecules that would eventually form you. You were already aware in some primitive sense, scattered and fragmented, long before you coalesced into a single identity. But this raises another paradox. If everything is conscious, then why do you not remember being starlight, or ocean, or soil? Perhaps the answer lies in integration. Consciousness before birth may not have been self-consciousness. It may have been awareness without memory, experience without a narrator. Only when neurons assembled into the highly complex network of the brain did awareness turn inward, recognizing itself as I. Before birth, you may have been awareness without reflection, a silent witness without words. Let us also think about time itself. Time feels like a straight line, but physics increasingly suggests it may not be so simple. Some theories describe all moments as existing simultaneously, like frames of a film reel. If this is true, then your birth, your life, and your death already exist within space-time. Before you were born, your consciousness may already exist in another part of the timeline, not yet experienced by the version of you that sits here now. In a sense, you were always already alive. You were just not yet in this particular frame. This theory is unsettling because it suggests free will may be an illusion, but it is also comforting because it means that you are woven into the fabric of eternity. You were never truly absent. You were always part of the totality of existence, even before you appeared in the scene we call life. Finally, consider the possibility that the very mystery itself is the point. To ask what you were before you were born is to step outside the ordinary boundaries of human thought. It forces you to confront the limits of knowledge, to stretch imagination, to live with paradox. In this way, the question itself is transformative. Perhaps the answer is less important than the expansion of awareness that comes from asking. By now, it becomes clear that the question itself is less about a definitive answer and more about how many ways we can learn to look at existence. One angle we haven't fully explored yet is the relationship between consciousness and memory. We often assume that consciousness begins with memory, that the ability to recall and link experiences creates the continuity we call self. Yet newborn infants who have no lasting memories are still conscious. They experience sensations, they respond to light, sound, and touch. They feel hunger and comfort. Consciousness without memory is still consciousness. So before you were born, it's possible your awareness was like this: pure sensation, pure being, without the narrative thread we later weave with memory. This brings us to the concept of pre-birth amnesia. If consciousness did exist before birth in some form, why don't we remember it? Some spiritual traditions claim that forgetting is necessary for growth. If you remembered everything from before, you might not fully immerse yourself in this life. Forgetting wipes the slate clean, allowing you to engage with existence as if for the first time. It is the forgetting that makes the remembering so meaningful. From a neurological perspective, memory depends on structures like the hippocampus, which develop only after birth. The brain of a fetus or newborn simply isn't built yet for long-term memory. That doesn't mean awareness wasn't there. It just means it wasn't recorded in the way we usually think of memory. Imagine a camera without a memory card. The images still pass through the lens. The light still hits the sensor, but nothing is stored. In this way, your consciousness before birth could have been real, but without the capacity to preserve the experience. Another fascinating perspective comes from the study of dreams. Dreams are a form of consciousness that can exist without the usual grounding in external reality. In dreams, we feel, think, and imagine, often without memory of how we arrived in the dreamscape. Some philosophers suggest that pre-birth consciousness might be dreamlike, an awareness untethered from linear time or clear identity, drifting in a space we can no longer recall once we awaken into life. If so, birth itself may be like waking from one dream into another, with the previous one forgotten but not necessarily unreal. We can also turn to physics again for new metaphors. In cosmology, the concept of potential energy is central. A stone at the top of a hill holds energy, not because it is moving, but because of where it is. Before you were born, perhaps your consciousness existed as potential energy, unrealized, waiting for the right moment to release into motion. Birth was the tipping point, the rolling of the stone, the conversion of potential into kinetic. You were not yet moving, but the energy was already there. Another scientific concept that illuminates this question is entropy, the tendency of systems to move from order to disorder. Life is the great exception, creating order from chaos, building complexity against the tide of entropy. Consciousness, in turn, may be the highest form of order life can produce. Before you were born, you were still part of the universe's entropy, scattered, unorganized. Birth and growth pulled you into increasing order, culminating in the improbable miracle of self-awareness. You were there in the disorder, waiting for order to call you forth. But perhaps the most intriguing theories come from information science. Some physicists and philosophers argue that the universe itself is made of information, and that matter and energy are simply expressions of that deeper reality. If this is true, then before you were born, you already existed as information, a pattern woven into the fabric of reality, like a song written but not yet sung. Your consciousness was not created out of nothing, but unfolded from information that was always there. This perspective raises a haunting possibility. If information never disappears, then perhaps nothing of you is ever truly lost. The pattern that became your consciousness may have existed before birth, and it may persist after death. Not as memory, not as personality, but as an eternal trace written into the universe itself. These scientific and philosophical perspectives all converge on one theme: continuity. Whether through atoms, information, or potential, something of you was here before you appeared. But they also challenge our everyday sense of identity, because the you that existed may not resemble the you know now. This is where spirituality often steps in, offering a bridge between continuity and identity. In Hindu philosophy, the concept of Atman, the eternal self, teaches that you were, are, and always will be. The Atman is unchanging, untouched by birth or death. Before you were born, you were pure awareness, the same awareness that animates you now. Birth was simply the moment when that eternal awareness clothed itself in a new form. In contrast, Buddhism suggests there is no eternal self. Instead, there is a stream of causes and conditions flowing endlessly. Before you were born, you were part of this stream, not as the same self, but as a continuation of energy, intention, and karma. What persists is not identity, but motion. What persists is not you, but the rippling of existence itself. Both of these traditions, though seemingly opposed, share something profound. They both deny that you ever came from nothing. Whether through eternal self or eternal motion, they teach that you were always already here in one form or another. Now let us return to the human heart of the question. Why do we care so much about what we were before birth? Perhaps it is because we hope the answer will also tell us what we will be after death. The two mysteries mirror each other: the nothingness before birth, the nothingness after death. If we can solve one, we feel we might solve the other. And so we search not just to understand the past, but to reassure ourselves about the future. The irony, of course, is that even if the answer is nothing, the fact that you are conscious now is no less wondrous. To have appeared from nothing is as miraculous as to have existed forever. In either case, your awareness is extraordinary. The further you travel, the more you realize that the journey itself may be the real destination. Let us take a moment to think about identity in its most basic form. You experience yourself as a continuous I, yet when you look closely, this I is built from countless pieces. Memories, feelings, perceptions, habits, all combine into the person you know as yourself, but none of them remain constant. Your body replaces its cells every few years. Your thoughts change daily. Your emotions shift moment by moment. If the self is built on such impermanence, perhaps it makes little sense to ask what you were before you were born. Perhaps the you we are trying to locate never existed in the way we think. This perspective aligns with the Buddhist concept of anatta, or non-self. It does not mean you don't exist, but that the self is not a fixed, eternal essence. It is a process, a collection, a flowing arrangement of conditions. In this light, before you were born, you were the conditions waiting to come together. You were causes without yet being an effect. You were threads waiting to be woven into the tapestry of a life. But Western philosophy too has wrestled with this question in striking ways. Think of John Locke, who argued that personal identity is rooted in memory. If memory makes the self, then before you were born, without any memories, you were no self at all. And yet this creates another paradox. Babies are conscious before they form memories. So if identity depends on memory, then infants would not have identity, even though they are undeniably alive and aware. This contradiction suggests that consciousness is deeper than memory, and that identity is only one layer of something more fundamental. Let us pivot to modern neuroscience. The brain is a network of neurons firing electrical signals, creating patterns of activity. Some scientists argue that consciousness is nothing more than the sum of these interactions. If so, then before you were born, you were not conscious, because your brain did not yet exist. But even within this view, the potential for consciousness was always present. Your neurons were forming, your DNA was guiding their growth, and the structure for awareness was being built. You were the blueprint before you were the building. Still, the brain-based explanation leaves something unresolved: the subjective quality of experience. Why should a network of neurons feel like something from the inside? Why should a storm of electrical activity result in the taste of chocolate, the sound of music, the color red? This is the so-called hard problem of consciousness, and it has baffled scientists and philosophers alike. Until it is solved, the question of what you were before birth remains not just open, but perhaps unanswerable. Yet the fact that it is unanswerable may be what makes it so powerful. Mystery awakens imagination. It invites humility. It allows us to see existence not as a solved puzzle, but as a living question. In that sense, asking what you were before you were born is less about finding an answer and more about entering into a state of wonder. Now consider another perspective, the role of ancestors. Before you were born, you existed in your lineage, not just genetically, but culturally. The stories, struggles, and choices of those who came before shaped the conditions of your life. You were not yet an individual, but you were already written into a larger human story. The foods your ancestors cultivated, the languages they spoke, the songs they sang, the wars they fought, all of these shaped the world into which you would eventually be born. In this sense, before you were born, you were already here, living in the lives of those who carried you forward. This idea is powerful because it grounds the mystery in something tangible. You may not know whether your soul existed before birth, but you know your ancestors did. You know their blood flows in your veins, their DNA shapes your form, their histories ripple into your present. You are, in a very real way, their continuation. And so before you were born, you were not nothing. You were lineage, you were legacy. But beyond the human lineage, there is also the lineage of life itself. Think of the first single-celled organisms billions of years ago. From them arose every living thing, including you. Before you were born, you were part of this ancient stream, this unbroken chain stretching back to the very dawn of life. You were already here, carried forward by the persistence of survival, by the endless drive to adapt and continue. Your consciousness was not yet awake, but the conditions for it were being prepared over eons. Now let us bring in another striking idea: simulation theory. Some scientists and philosophers have speculated that our reality might itself be a kind of simulation, like an incredibly advanced computer program. If this were true, then before you were born, you might not have existed as a conscious being, but as code, a set of instructions waiting to be activated. Your consciousness would be like a character in a video game, dormant until the game is loaded. Birth would be the moment the program began to run. Though speculative, this metaphor is powerful because it reframes consciousness not as something created, but as something executed. You were always present in the code, but you had not yet been played. Of course, whether or not reality is a simulation, the metaphor points to a deeper truth. Consciousness may be inseparable from patterns, from structures, from information. If this is so, then before you were born, you were not nothing. You were structure waiting for activation, pattern waiting for expression. But let us not forget the most immediate human dimension of this mystery. Imagine holding a newborn baby. In that tiny being is a consciousness just beginning to awaken to the world. The baby does not remember where it came from. It has no words to describe its experience. And yet the spark of awareness is unmistakable. The mystery of pre-birth consciousness is not abstract. It is right there in the gaze of the newborn, in the first cry, in the silent awareness that precedes language. Perhaps this is the closest we can come to an answer. Before you were born, you were the silence before the cry, the stillness before the gaze, the potential before the spark. You were the pause before the music begins, the blank canvas before the first stroke of paint. And just as a painting cannot be separated from its canvas, perhaps your life cannot be separated from the silence that came before. As we arrive at the end of this long exploration, we return once again to the beginning, the question of what your consciousness was before you were born. We have circled through philosophy, science, spirituality, and imagination, turning the question over and over like a stone in the hand, feeling its smooth surface and its hidden weight. Each angle has revealed something different, sometimes comforting, sometimes unsettling, always mysterious. We've seen how neuroscience ties consciousness to the developing brain, suggesting that before birth, you were the blueprint of awareness, waiting to be assembled. We've seen how physics allows us to think of your existence as potential energy, as information encoded in the fabric of the universe, waiting for the spark of life to bring it into form. We've seen how spiritual traditions describe you as either an eternal self that has always existed or as a stream of causes and conditions flowing endlessly forward. And we've reflected on how lineage, genetic, cultural, and cosmic carried you here long before your first breath. But as much as these perspectives teach us, they all point to one ultimate realization. The mystery will never be fully solved, and maybe it isn't supposed to be. To exist in mystery is to exist in wonder. The fact that we cannot pin down where consciousness came from only deepens the awe of having it now. Consider this: you are here, alive, listening, thinking, imagining. Out of all the possible configurations of matter and energy in the universe, this one has given rise to your experience. Whatever you were before you were born, it has led you here to this moment. That is extraordinary. It means that even if you were nothing before, that nothingness has produced something as vast and luminous as your awareness. And if you were always here in some form, then your life is a continuation of something eternal, and you are part of a story far bigger than yourself. This duality, nothing or everything, absence or eternity, frames the paradox of existence. The fact that either possibility could be true is what makes your life meaningful. If you came from nothing, then every moment is infinitely precious, a spark that shines only once. If you are eternal, then every moment is equally profound, part of an unbroken chain of being. Either way, the conclusion is the same. Your consciousness is a gift, a miracle, a fleeting or everlasting treasure. And perhaps that is the point. To look back and wonder is not to find an answer, but to awaken gratitude for the mystery itself. What you were before you were born may never be known, but what you are now is undeniable. A living, conscious being, capable of wonder, reflection, love, and awe. So where does this leave us? It leaves us in a place of quiet contemplation, a place where you can look at the night sky and feel the echo of the stars that became your body, a place where you can think of your ancestors and feel their presence flowing in your blood, a place where you can imagine both nothingness and eternity, and realize that either way, your life matters beyond measure. As we close this exploration, take a moment to notice the strangeness of awareness itself. Notice how thoughts arise and fall away, how sensations flicker and change, how the self you call you is both familiar and mysterious. Notice that consciousness itself is not something you control. It is something you witness, something you inhabit, something that holds you as much as you hold it. And now, as we end, let us return to where we began, with sleep. For sleep, in many ways, mirrors the mystery of before and after. Each night, you surrender consciousness, slipping into dreams or into the quiet nothingness of deep sleep. You vanish, and then you return. You wake in the morning as if reborn, with no memory of the nothingness you passed through. Sleep is a daily rehearsal of both birth and death, a reminder that consciousness is not fixed but fluid, not constant but ever renewing. Perhaps before you were born, your consciousness was like deep sleep, silent, unknowable, without memory. And perhaps after death, it'll be like sleep again, a return to that quiet place beyond thought and time. Yet every morning you awaken and every day you live shows that even from the silence, awareness can rise again. So as you drift towards sleep tonight, let yourself rest in this mystery. You do not need to solve it. You do not need to know where you came from or where you are going. It is enough to know that you are here now, alive in this moment, conscious and aware. Whatever you were before birth, whatever you will be after death, right now you are, and that is more miraculous than any answer could ever be. Thank you for joining me on this journey. May the mystery bring you peace, may the questions bring you wonder, and may your sleep tonight carry you gently into the quiet depths of existence, where all beginnings and endings meet.